The Appalachian Mountains are more than a stretch of rugged hills and valleys. They are a living storybook carved in stone and shadow. From Georgia up through Kentucky, Virginia, and into Pennsylvania, this land has shaped people who learned to survive with little but their faith, their hands, and their stories. Life in those mountains was hard. Winters were bitter, summers sweltering, and the isolation nearly unbearable. Roads were scarce, communities scattered, and families often lived miles apart, connected only by dirt paths and kinship ties. But with hardship came resilience. These mountain people leaned on each other, and more importantly, they leaned on traditions that gave meaning to their lives. Folk songs, storytelling, herbal remedies, and spiritual rituals were not just quaint customs. They were survival tools. They carried wisdom, healed wounds, and gave a sense of order to a life that often felt unpredictable. And among these practices, one of the strangest yet most telling emerged: the act of grave talking. Grave talking was not some fanciful ghost tale whispered to scare children. It was a practice woven into the very culture of the people. Imagine a mountain settlement in the late 1008. Hundreds. A family lays a loved one to rest in a small graveyard on the hillside, the red clay freshly turned, the morning songs fading into silence. The grieving family leaves, but one person, usually chosen or called, remains behind. This was the grave talker. His or her task was simple yet profound. Sit by the grave, whisper prayers, and invite the spirit of the dead to speak what was left unsaid. Why did they do this? Because the mountain people believed that death was not an end but a doorway. And just as a locked door rattles when something on the other side needs to come through, a restless soul could disturb the living if it carried unresolved secrets. The grave talker's role was to open that door, to let the whispers out, to ease the spirit and protect the family. This may sound strange to modern ears, but it fit perfectly into the worldview of Appalachian folk culture. These people believed in signs, omens, and dreams. They read meaning in the wind, the flight of birds, the cry of animals at night. They believed the veil between life and death was thin, and to ignore it was dangerous. To them it was not superstition, it was responsibility. The roots of this practice likely came from a mix of influences. The Scotch-Irish settlers brought with them old-world traditions of second sight and communion with the dead. African spiritual traditions brought by enslaved people who also lived in the region carried deep beliefs in ancestor communication. Native American practices respected the dead as ever-present guides in the land of the living. In Appalachia, where cultures collided and isolation forced people to rely on one another's knowledge, these traditions mingled into something new, something uniquely their own. But grave talking was not something anyone desired. It was often seen as a burden, a heavy calling. To sit in the stillness of a graveyard at night, when the fog rolled low and every sound felt louder than it should, was not an enviable role. Many who were chosen described a weight that pressed upon them, as though the earth itself were leaning in to whisper. Some said they heard actual words in their mind, confessions, regrets, or warnings. Others said they simply felt an impression, a knowing that came from outside themselves. Whether real or imagined, the impact was undeniable. Families trusted the grave talkers. If they said the deceased was at peace, the family found comfort. If they warned of an unresolved matter, a stolen inheritance, an unconfessed sin, a feud that could spill into violence, the family paid attention. The mountains taught people to take signs seriously because survival often depended on it. Still, there was a darker side. These grave talkers carried what they heard like locked chests inside them. They could not repeat the dead's confessions, for it was considered sacred trust. A man might learn that his great-uncle had killed someone decades earlier, but he could never tell. A woman might hear that her grandmother had hidden away a child born out of wedlock, but she would take that secret to her grave. In time, these talkers became weighted with generations of buried truth. And that is why this practice is worth remembering. The grave talkers weren't simply mystics or storytellers. They were mirrors of the human need to be heard even in death. They reveal to us something essential. People everywhere long for closure. They long to know their lives mattered, their mistakes won't haunt their children, and their truths won't die with them. The roots of this Appalachian custom remind us that every culture, no matter how remote, develops ways of dealing with the silence of death. Some use rituals, some use confessionals, some use prayer circles or wakes. The grave talkers used midnight whispers in the graveyard. The form may change, but the need is universal, and here lies the lesson for us today. Many of us are still burying truths, still leaving words unspoken, still allowing silence to carry what should be confessed. We may not believe in grave talking, but how many families still live with secrets buried under layers of pride or shame? How many children inherit wounds they don't understand because no one ever dared to speak them aloud? The Appalachian grave talkers may be gone, their practice buried under time and progress, but their roots run deep. They teach us that the weight of silence is real, that truth unspoken can haunt generations, and that we must not wait until the grave to speak what needs to be said. The mountains shaped them into people who could endure, but endurance came at a cost. The grave talkers remind us, you don't have to carry secrets to your grave. Speak them, heal from them, free yourself and those who come after you, for silence may protect a moment, but truth saves a lifetime. In the hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, traditions often lingered longer than they should have. The world outside was changing. Railroads stretched across states, cities rose with brick and steel, but in the mountain towns, customs rooted in old fears and older beliefs still held sway. Among those customs was the eerie practice of grave talking. Families believed that when someone died with unfinished business, their spirit would not rest until a living soul stood by their grave and spoke aloud the unspoken words. Confessions, apologies, secrets too heavy to carry to the other side. And so, the responsibility to speak these words was passed down. But who wanted such a duty, who wanted to stand in the cold dirt beneath moonlight, whispering things they had no part in but were sworn to deliver? None of the young men or women of the mountains volunteered for it. It was not a role that brought honor, but one that brought whispers of fear. The grave talkers, the townsfolk muttered, they live closer to the dead than to the living. The task usually fell to the poorest families, those who could not refuse because tradition was as binding as hunger. In one small Appalachian town in the 1880s, that burden fell on the McBrides. For 3 generations, their name was tied to grave talking. When someone died and left behind secrets, it was the McBrides who went to the graveyard at midnight, speaking the words the family wrote down or confessed. Sometimes it was a stolen inheritance. Sometimes it was a love affair. Other times it was something darker, sins too heavy to confess in life, yet too dangerous to keep in silence after death. The McBride children grew up knowing their nights would not be free like others. While their friends sang songs by the fire, they stood among headstones, whispering words not their own. They learned early that silence was safer than questions. But inside, resentment grew. Why us? They often wondered. Why do we have to carry the shame of other families? Why do we speak words that burn our throats while others sleep peacefully in their beds? It was a duty no one wanted because it demanded more than just presence. Grave talking required courage, the kind of courage that looked madness in the eye. The cemetery at night was not a place of comfort. Owls screeched, winds howled through the pines, and shadows stretched long. A child standing there with a folded piece of paper felt the weight of not just words, but of death itself pressing down. They were messengers between the living and the dead, but no one thanked them. No one gave them respect. Instead, people crossed the road when they passed, muttering about cursed bloodlines. Still, the McBrides endured. They endured because poverty gave them no choice, and because traditions have a way of tightening their grip the more one resists. Yet as the years passed, cracks began to show. Young Samuel McBride, the eldest of his generation, began to question. He was just 16 when he stood over the grave of a man who had beaten his wife all his life. The widow had handed Samuel a note to read. In it were words of apology that the man himself had never spoken in life. Samuel read them aloud as the woman cried into her shawl, but anger churned inside him. Why should I give his ghost peace? Samuel thought, when he gave no peace to the living. The duty, once heavy but tolerable, was becoming unbearable. Each grave they stood by was another reminder that the living used the McBrides as tools, as vessels to cleanse guilt, without ever considering the cost to their souls. Samuel's sister, Ruth, spoke the truth plainly one evening. We're burying ourselves a little each time we talk for the dead. It was a duty no one wanted because it stripped the living of their dignity. Speaking for the dead meant silencing yourself. It meant swallowing your own fear, your own anger, your own longing for freedom, all so others could sleep without nightmares. But here lies the lesson. Life often hands us burdens we never asked for. Sometimes you are born into a role that feels unfair, into responsibilities that crush you. Poverty, tradition, or circumstance, these forces dictate paths that feel impossible to escape. The McBrides remind us that resentment will fester if we never confront the unfair duties placed upon us. They remind us that silence is not survival, but a slow death. What began as a duty no one wanted eventually became the breaking point for Samuel. He realized that true courage was not in standing by graves at midnight, but in saying no more. His defiance was not only for himself, but for every generation after him. He chose to break the chain of duty, even if it meant shame from the townsfolk. Because sometimes the bravest act is refusing the weight others try to force onto your shoulders. And so the grave talkers faded into history, not because death stopped claiming secrets, but because one family chose life over tradition. The story of the McBrides is a mirror for us today. How often do we accept roles that suffocate us simply because that's the way it's always been? How often do we bury ourselves beneath duties that serve everyone but us? It is noble to sacrifice, yes, but when sacrifice becomes slavery, when your humanity is traded for silence, then it is no longer duty. It is a prison. Remember this, life may hand you burdens you did not choose, but it also hands you the power to say, "This ends with me." You may not change the past, but you can change the story that will be told about you. That is the legacy of the grave talkers, a reminder that the heaviest duties are sometimes the ones we were never meant to carry, and the truest freedom is found when we lay them down. In the mist-shrouded hills of Appalachia, where fog clung to the trees like ghosts reluctant to leave, the grave talkers carried more than their lanterns and whispered rituals. They carried secrets, burdens left behind by the dead, confessions too heavy for the living to hear. Secrets are not weightless things. They cling to the soul, add stones to the conscience, and bend a person until their spine aches from what they dare not say. For the grave talkers, silence was not just a choice. It was survival. The families of those hills often came to them in desperation. A mother who feared her son's spirit was restless, a father who wanted to know why his crops withered after his brother's death, or a daughter who believed her late mother had hidden away money no one could find. The grave talkers would kneel by the mound of earth, murmur their chants, and listen in the quiet hours of night. Sometimes, they claimed, the dead answered, not in booming voices but in impressions, thoughts that pressed into their minds as if a soul was leaning close and whispering into their ear. But here is the part few outsiders understood. What the grave talkers learned was not always meant to be repeated. The dead, unbound from flesh, carried truths the living never wanted to hear. A man might confess he'd sired children with someone other than his wife. A woman might reveal she had poisoned her husband after years of beatings. A grandfather might whisper the truth of stolen land or broken promises that cursed his descendants. And so, the grave talkers held these secrets in silence. They did not write them down. They did not share them with their kin. They became vaults of confession, walking graves themselves, carrying words never spoken aloud. It changed them. There was a woman named Clara Mee, remembered in one family's stories. She was a grave talker whose hair turned white before she was 30, though she was not sick. Some said it was the strain of what she carried. One tale told that she was once called to speak with the spirit of a man who had been murdered. When she returned, she could barely lift her head. "I know who killed him," she whispered to her sister, "but I cannot speak it. If I do, this family will be torn apart." And she never did. The murderer lived on unpunished, but Clara Mee bore the shame as if it were her own crime. This was the curse of their work. The grave talkers could not simply shrug and walk away. Secrets once heard cling to the mind. They return in dreams, in the quiet of dawn, in the rustling of leaves outside the cabin door. Clara Mee was not alone. Others carried similar burdens. Men grew silent and withdrawn, their eyes shadowed. Women aged too quickly, their faces lined not from years but from knowledge. The weight of secrets broke some, just as surely as poverty or disease. But still they kept the silence. Why? Because they believed that some truths, if spoken aloud, would do more harm than good. They thought of the children who would lose fathers, the wives who would be disgraced, the families who would be ripped apart. And so they bore it themselves, convinced they were sparing others. This is where the story holds its power for us today. How often do we do the same? How often do we carry burdens that are not ours to hold, secrets that twist our spirit until it feels heavy? Maybe it's a family truth no one dares acknowledge. Maybe it's a wrong we witnessed but never reported. Maybe it's our own silent pain that we lock away because we fear what others would think if they knew. The grave talkers remind us that silence is not without cost. They may have believed they were protecting the living, but in truth, they often destroyed themselves in the process. Secrets left them sick, weary, and haunted. Silence became a slow death, a coffin of their own making. And yet, here lies the lesson. No one is meant to carry the full weight of secrets alone. The grave talkers did what they thought necessary, but we, in our time, must choose differently. We must learn that truth, while painful, is also freeing. Confession, while terrifying, is also healing. In every Appalachian tale, the grave talkers leave us with a warning. The dead cannot undo the choices they made, but the living can. We have the chance to speak, to seek justice, to heal before the burden breaks us. If secrets poisoned the grave talkers, then honesty is the antidote we must learn to embrace. Their lives echo across the hills, not as ghost stories alone, but as moral lessons. To live in silence is to bury yourself before your time. To speak truth, even when it shakes the foundations of family or community, is to step into the light. The grave talkers carried the secrets of others, but you and I must ask, what secrets do we carry today? And what will it cost us if we refuse to let them go? The mountains of Appalachia are more than rock and soil. They are memory. Beneath every mound of earth rests not only a body but a story, a testimony of how someone lived, what they endured, and what they left behind. The grave talkers understood this truth better than anyone. For them, a cemetery was not a place of silence but a library. Each grave was a book, each whisper of the wind a page turning. They believed the dead still spoke, not in words the ear could hear, but in lessons the heart could feel if only one listened closely enough. It is easy for us to think of the past as gone, sealed away under the weight of years. But in those Appalachian hills the past never stayed buried. Families carried the memory of every mistake, every triumph, every tragedy. The grave talkers who spent their nights in communion with the forgotten became the keepers of this invisible thread. They understood that the ground itself held lessons. Some were warnings, some were reminders, and some were cries for redemption. One such lesson was whispered to a man named Elias Turner, a grave talker whose reputation traveled far beyond his mountain hollow. He was said to have sat by the grave of a young boy, barely 12 years old, who died in a mining accident. The family had always believed it was a cruel twist of fate. But as Elias kept vigil, he claimed he felt the boy's spirit press upon him, not with sorrow, but with urgency. The truth, Elias revealed quietly later, was that the boy had been sent into the mines too young, too soon, because his family needed the money. The lesson buried there was not just about loss, but about desperation, poverty, and the price paid when survival outweighed safety. Elias never accused, never condemned, but he carried the story so that others might think twice before repeating the same mistake. Another lesson came from a woman named Ruthie Hale, who lived to see nearly 90 winters. As a girl, she followed her mother, also a grave talker, to the cemetery. She remembered kneeling by the grave of a woman who had died in childbirth. She wanted me to know. Ruthie recalled later in her life that bitterness had killed her long before the child came. She lived angry, resenting everyone, even her own husband. By the time she carried life, she was too hollow inside to hold it. For Ruthie, that whisper became a lifelong lesson. Bitterness corrodes, love sustains. She spent her years telling her children and grandchildren never to let anger become their master. The grave talkers understood what we often forget. The ground is a teacher if you are humble enough to learn. The soil holds the cost of greed, the price of pride, the shadow of injustice. In the coal towns, graves told of collapsed tunnels and black lung disease. In the isolated hollows, stones marked children who never made it past their first winter because doctors were too far away and medicine too expensive. And in every cemetery, unmarked plots whispered of those too poor, too shamed, or too forgotten to be remembered properly. But not all lessons were heavy with sorrow. Some were filled with hope. Grave talkers spoke of spirits who reminded them that love does not end at the grave. A man might tell his widow, "Do not wear your mourning clothes forever. Live." A mother might urge her children to forgive one another before bitterness carved its scars. These lessons buried in the ground carried healing as much as they carried warning. The question we must ask ourselves today is this: are we listening? We may not kneel by graveyards in the misty hours of night, but the lessons are still there, buried in the lives that came before us. Every ancestor, every story, every headstone is a reminder that we are not the first to walk this path. The struggles we face, poverty, loss, pride, forgiveness, were wrestled with by those who came before us. They left their lessons, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the soil itself. Too often we ignore them. We repeat their mistakes because we refuse to learn. We chase money until it costs us our health, just as miners did. We let grudges fester until they destroy relationships, just as bitter hearts once did. We remain silent about injustices, believing it easier to bury truth than to speak it, just as the grave talkers were often forced to do. And then we wonder why the same pains resurface, generation after generation. The grave talkers remind us that wisdom is not only in books or sermons. It is buried in the ground, in the stories of those who lived before us. To honor them is not just to place flowers on their graves, but to learn from their lives. To walk differently, to carry their lessons forward instead of burying them deeper. Perhaps that is why the Appalachian people held their grave talkers with both reverence and fear. They were not just intermediaries with the dead, they were teachers carrying forward the lessons buried in the ground. They reminded their neighbors that every choice echoes beyond the moment, and every life, no matter how short, hard, or obscure, has something to teach the living. Today, the cemeteries of Appalachia still stand, quiet but not silent. The stones lean with age, the names fade, but the lessons remain. They wait for anyone willing to listen. And maybe that is the truest legacy of the grave talkers. They teach us not to fear the ground but to respect it, not to run from death but to learn from it. Because in the end, the earth does not just hold bodies. It holds wisdom, and the wisest among us are those who take the time to hear it before they, too, are buried beneath the ground. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is a weight that presses down so heavily it feels like suffocation. In the hollows of Appalachia, where mountains rise like great green walls, silence was not just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something deeper, darker. The grave talkers knew this kind of silence well. They walked into it, sat with it, listened to it, and carried it home in their bones. To the outsider, the mountains seemed alive with noise, the whippoorwill's call at dusk, the rustle of deer in the underbrush, the creak of old cabins settling in the night. But the grave talkers spoke of a silence beneath it all, a silence that seemed to come from the graves themselves. It was not the silence of rest, but of secrets withheld, truths untold, and pain unspoken. This silence consumed not only the dead, but the living who refused to face what had been buried. One such tale was told of a man named Joseph Riddle, who worked the mines until his lungs were black with coal dust. His family buried him quickly with little said. No one spoke of how the company had denied him fair wages, how they had ignored his pleas for better safety measures, how he coughed himself to death while his children starved. His grave stood quiet, but the silence surrounding his story was deafening. The grave talkers who visited him would say, "His silence speaks louder than any cry." And they carried that silence not as comfort, but as indictment. Silence consumes when communities choose not to speak of what they know. In those Appalachian towns, women who suffered at the hands of cruel husbands often went to their graves with no justice. Only whispers passed from porch to porch. Children who endured hunger, abuse, or abandonment became grown men and women who carried the silence forward, too ashamed or too broken to speak. That silence spread like wildfire, unstoppable, invisible, destructive. It devoured not just individuals, but generations. The grave talkers often felt this silence pressing on them more heavily than any ghostly voice. One woman, Eliza Me, confessed that the silence was worse than the spirits. A spirit will at least try to say something, she told her daughter, but silence, it gnaws at you. It makes you wonder what's been left unsaid. What truth was so terrible it had to be buried forever. She claimed the silence sat on her chest at night, as if the ground itself had risen up to crush her. But silence does not only consume through sorrow, it consumes through fear. In those years, coal companies held power like kings. Speak against them and you could lose your job, your home, even your life. Families kept quiet, even when fathers died in collapsed shafts or boys were swallowed by machinery. Silence was survival, but that survival carried a price. Every unsaid word became a stone, and soon whole communities were weighed down with stones too heavy to carry. The grave talkers, in their own way, became breakers of silence, not always with bold speeches or loud accusations, but with quiet acknowledgments. They named what others refused to name. They said, "This man did not just die, he was worked to death." They whispered, "This woman did not just fall ill, she died of loneliness, bitterness, and neglect." In giving words to silence, they loosened its grip, even if only a little. Yet there is danger in confronting silence. For some, breaking it meant exile, shame, or retribution. Many grave talkers carried burdens not just of what they heard, but of what they dared to repeat. Families turned cold against them, neighbors whispered about them, and some even accused them of witchcraft. After all, it is easier to label someone cursed than to admit that your community's silence has been complicit in suffering. Still, the grave talkers understood a truth we often avoid. Silence consumes because it protects lies. As long as no one speaks, injustice thrives. As long as grief is hidden, healing cannot begin. As long as the dead remain voiceless, the living repeat their mistakes. And so, they risked the scorn of neighbors and the weight of secrets to ensure that silence did not swallow everything whole. The lesson for us is clear. Today, silence still consumes. Families carry unspoken wounds from generations past, abuse swept under rugs, betrayals never confessed, forgiveness never offered. Communities ignore injustices, pretending not to see what is right in front of them. Individuals bury their pain so deep that it eats them alive from the inside. We live in a world noisy with distraction, yet full of silences that crush us. The question is, will we let silence continue to consume us, or will we speak? Speaking is not always loud. It may be a whisper, a confession, a truth told at the right moment. It may be the courage to tell a child, "This is where we went wrong, so you don't have to repeat it." It may be the decision to call out corruption, even if it costs you comfort. Speaking is risky, but silence is deadly. The grave talkers leave us with this haunting reminder. The ground is already full of silence. If the living refuse to speak truth, we are only feeding the soil more of the same. The silence that consumes will grow, and one day it will bury us too. But if we dare to break it, if we dare to give words to the pain, the injustice, the hope buried beneath, then silence loses its power. Then the graves become not just resting places, but teachers. Then we can walk lighter, freer, no longer consumed. Because silence does not have the last word unless we let it. It is easy to mistake the grave talkers for something eerie, something belonging only to the shadows of superstition. Outsiders called them strange, sometimes even cursed, because they lingered in cemeteries and spoke of whispers carried on the wind. But those who knew them best understood that their purpose was never about frightening people, or even about communing with the dead in some mystical ritual. Their purpose was heavier, nobler, and far more unsettling. The real message of the grave talkers was not about death at all. It was about life. When they bent their ear toward the silence of the graves, what they heard was not meant to entertain, nor to satisfy curiosity about the other side. No, what they carried back was a reminder, sometimes gentle, sometimes harsh. Life is fragile, short, and filled with choices that echo long after the body is gone. The dead had stories, yes, but the stories mattered because they were lessons for the living. Take, for instance, the tale of Hannah Cole. She was buried on a hillside with no marker, just a rough wooden cross. The grave talkers said they felt her sorrow more than they heard her words. She had lived her whole life serving others, never speaking her dreams aloud, never daring to step beyond the expectations placed on her. By the time she realized her years had slipped away, it was too late. Her message, carried through the grave talkers, was one of urgency. Don't waste your life waiting. Speak what's inside you before the ground swallows it. This was the essence of what the grave talkers offered, not horror, but clarity. They brought forward voices of regret, warning the living not to make the same mistakes. They carried words of gratitude, too, from those who found peace in simple love or faith, urging the living to value what truly matters before it is gone. But here's the truth. People rarely wanted to hear these messages. It was easier to dismiss the grave talkers as haunted or mad than to face the uncomfortable truths they carried. Who among us wants to hear that we are wasting our time, that our grudges and greed are meaningless in the shadow of eternity? Who wants to be reminded that wealth, pride, and reputation crumble just as quickly as a wooden coffin in damp soil? The grave talkers became outcasts not because they lied, but because they told truths that no one wanted to confront. Their message was often summarized in a single phrase: the dead have no use for lies. That is why their voices carried such weight. In life, people cover their failures with excuses, dress their shame in silence, and wrap their sins in justifications. But the grave strips all that away. The grave talkers were simply the messengers, repeating what the dead had learned too late. And there was something else, something more profound. The grave talkers insisted that the voices of the dead were not merely echoes of individual lives, but part of a collective warning. A community that forgets its dead forgets its lessons. Each unspoken truth, each buried injustice, each silent regret was not confined to a single grave. It spread like a shadow over the entire town, shaping generations. To ignore the messages of the dead was to invite repetition of the same pain. This is why they walked graveyards not with fear but with reverence. To them, cemeteries were not fields of sorrow but classrooms. Every headstone was a lesson, every mound of earth a reminder. One grave might whisper, "Don't let pride destroy your family." Another might murmur, "Cherish the time you have, it runs faster than you think." Another might cry out, "Speak truth, even if it costs you, because silence will cost you more." The real message of the grave talkers was simple, but it carried the weight of eternity. Live differently, live wisely, live honestly before it's too late. And yet, perhaps the most haunting part of their message was this: the dead do not envy us for our wealth, our strength, or our power. They envy us only for our time. The smallest child playing in the dust has more than the greatest king lying beneath the ground, because the child still has a tomorrow. That truth, once spoken, was enough to shake even the proudest men of the mountains. Still, not everyone listened. Many turned away. They said the grave talkers were madwomen, drunkards, or witches, but others, those who chose to hear, walked away changed. A father once confessed that after speaking with a grave talker, he went home, gathered his children, and told them the words he had long been too proud to say: "I love you, I'm sorry, you matter more than all the work in the world." That night he broke the silence that might have haunted his grave. So, what do we do with the real message of the grave talkers today? We must recognize that their truth still applies. The world may be louder now, filled with distractions and endless noise, but the core lesson remains. Life is short, regrets weigh heavier than failures, silence destroys more than words ever could, and the clock does not stop for anyone. The real message of the grave talkers is not meant to frighten us into superstition. It is meant to wake us up. It is a call to action, to speak, to love, to forgive, to build, to live in such a way that when we finally lie beneath the earth, our silence will not consume us. Because our words, our deeds, our love will already have spoken loudly enough. For in the end, the grave talkers remind us that the dead have only one sermon to preach. Do not wait until the ground has closed over you to live the life you are meant to live.